Welcome back, everyone, to APUS History Era 4. In this video, we're going to continue our look at the market revolution, this time focusing on topic 4.6 and the effects of the revolution on American culture and society. The theme this time is social structures, with the categories, roles, and practices that began, continued, or changed during this time period, and how those changed the lives of the American people. So let's get started. 1812, the overall population of the United States began a period of very rapid growth. Both the free white population as well as the non-white, mostly slave population. And while the importation of slaves had been banned in 1808, some ships still smuggled in new slaves, usually by claiming that they were simply moving slaves from one coastal city to another, which was unrestricted. Natural population growth was very high, with large families still the norm. But you also had significant immigration to the U.S., especially beginning in the 1830s. To give you an idea of how much growth was happening, let's look at some numbers. Overall, the population of the U.S. was doubling roughly every 25 years, almost all due to natural increases. And overall, this population growth was contributing to the westward expansion, and that expansion itself also tempted many to journey to the United States in the first place, because land was available. Now, this can be seen in the location of what is called the geographic center of population of the United States, as it steadily moved westward. In 1790, it was east of Baltimore. By 1830, it was approximately on the present-day West Virginia, Maryland, Virginia border. And by 1860, it was in southern Ohio. By 1830, a third of Americans lived west of the Alleghenies, and that number kept increasing since land was cheaper and readily available out west, usually with those settlements beginning along major rivers, so as to have an accessible transportation route for the products of their farms. Cities also grew along these rivers, especially the Ohio and Mississippi rivers, and they grew rapidly, serving as a distribution center for crops that would then be transported to the major eastern cities. But it isn't just the natural reproduction of American citizens that was contributing to this growth in population. The number of immigrants also began to increase, with the number of immigrants arriving more than doubling in the 1820s decade alone, then quadrupling in the 1830s, and then tripling again in the 1840s. By 1850, about 10% of the overall U.S. population was foreign-born. One of the biggest immigrant groups during this time period was the Irish, mostly as Britain eased travel restrictions for them, hoping to use them to populate Canada, although many of those ended up in the United States anyway. Once the potato crops began to fail in the 1840s, even more began to arrive, amounting to almost 1 million Irishmen total. German immigrants also made up a significant portion of the immigrant population, mostly due to failed revolutions and poor economic conditions in Central Europe. Although both of these groups were European and arrived around the same time, there were some key differences between these two groups. The Irish, driven by the potato famine, which began in 1845, emigrated directly from their homeland to escape poverty and death. And as most were very poor, they tended to find work in or near the cities where they arrived, many finding work in the New England textile mills, with more immigrant men seeking work in the mills, displacing the young women who were already working there. This reliance on foreign workers actually kind of forced the mills to give up what they had trying to become in creating opportunities for young women. Poverty actually kind of snuck up on these mill owners, as many of these new immigrant workers were living in poverty, and the housing that they were living in was overcrowded, effectively becoming slums. And when that meant then that you had this whole lower class grouping of families of immigrant workers that tended to live in what were starting to be called tenement neighborhoods. And they weren't living in company housing. They were living in whatever housing they could find. Now, for the Germans, the failed revolutions in Central Europe in the late 1840s that were seeking various democratic changes resulted in tens of thousands of people being killed and many more being forced into exile. For Germans in particular, many intellectuals and activists had fled into exile and then to the United States. Bad times and poor conditions in Europe drove people out, while land, relatives, freedom, opportunity, and jobs here in the U.S. lured them in. The people arriving from Germany included many professionals, journalists, even politicians. And as many of this group were at least of moderate means, they were able to travel further to the west once they arrived here, often to many Midwestern cities, and often were able to purchase land for farming, especially in places like Missouri. But not everyone welcomed the increasing number of immigrants. This anti-immigrant stance is called Nativism, and it took the form of political anti-Catholicism directed mostly at the Irish, although you still saw anti-German sentiments as well. Nativists objected primarily to Irish Roman Catholics because of their loyalty to the Pope, and also because of their supposed rejection of republicanism as an American ideal. Many of the Catholics, as well as German Lutherans, became Democrats, and most other Protestants were joining the Whig Party, or, once it was established, the new Republican Party. In the 1840s, small-scale riots between Catholics and Nativists took place in several American cities. In Philadelphia in 1844, for example, a series of Nativist assaults on Catholic churches and community centers resulted in the loss of numerous lives and the professionalization of the police force. In Louisville, Kentucky, Election Day rioters killed at least 22 people in attacks on both Germans and Irish Catholics on August 6, 1855, in what became known as Bloody Monday at the time. But the Germans, like I said, they were targeted too. From the 1840s and actually even longer, German Americans were distrusted because of their separatist social structure, their German language schools, their German language newspapers, and basically because of their continued attachment to their native tongue over using English. Nativism would become significant politically into the 1850s with the formation of the Know Nothing Party. It started out as a secret society and later emerged officially as the American Party, but its members were nicknamed Know Nothings because when they were asked about the secret society, they would reply that they knew nothing about it. The Know Nothings believed that there was a Romanist conspiracy that was trying to subvert civil and religious liberty in America, and they were hoping to organize native-born Protestants to defend traditional religious and political values. In most places in the U.S., Know-Nothingism lasted only a year or two before it fell apart because of weak local leaders, very few publicly declared national leaders, and a very deep split over the issue of slavery. After the collapse of the Whig Party in the 1850s, though, the Know-Nothings were able to win several high-level state positions, at least until the Republican Party was formed. As the U.S. increasingly industrialized, the cities where the factories were located grew and expanded, and offered a variety of employment opportunities for immigrants and internal migrants alike. Cities were densely populated as people had to live within walking distance of work and shops. Streets were narrow, often just wide enough to accommodate pedestrians and wagons. Prior to 1790, there were just 2 cities with populations greater than 20,000 people, and that was New York and Philadelphia. By 1860, that number had increased to 43, and there was a lot of smaller cities as well. In fact, the percentage of the overall population living in the cities was increasing rapidly, from just 3% of the population living in cities in 1790 to 16% of the population in 1860. But if you look at these maps, most of the large cities were located in the northern parts of the U.S. New Orleans, because of its role in shipping goods that were floating down the Mississippi River, was the major exception in the South. New York, though, was by far the biggest, and it surpassed 1 million people by 1860. The availability of jobs was one of the main reasons why people lived in the cities, but many immigrants were settling there because they simply couldn't afford to move beyond the city that they had arrived to, and again, jobs were available, so they stayed. And within these cities, a class structure developed, based primarily on wealth. The elites were the wealthiest, and these merchants, lawyers, and manufacturers often built substantial townhouses on the main thoroughfares, within walking distance of the docks, warehouses, offices, courts, and shops where they worked and often owned. The middle class were those who filled the roles of managers and other professionals, which would include some lawyers, but doctors as well. They tended to live a little further out from the city center, on the edges of the upper-class neighborhoods. Markets, shops, taverns, and concert halls provided services and entertainment, and the middle class had money to spend on that. And then there was the working class, also called the working poor, who sat at the bottom and were by far the most numerous. Poorer people lived in the back alleys and courtyards of the central city, or they lived much further out, away from the economic and governmental centers, as well as the urban amenities like town watches, water pumps, and garbage collection. The growth of manufacturing led to a significant increase in prosperity for these individuals and standards of living in the U.S., which was especially evident in these cities, but you saw it in rural areas as well. The higher standards of living affected everyone, but the rich were usually getting a greater benefit from this increase. In other words, the gap between the rich and the poor was growing. Social mobility, which is the ability to increase wealth across generations, was possible, but it was unlikely to happen in one person's lifetime. It would usually take several successive generations for people to move from poor into the elites of society. However, there were still many more economic opportunities in the U.S. than there were for people in Europe, which again continued to attract people to immigrate to the U.S. in the first place. Also keep in mind that although slavery had been abolished in the northern states, the northern textile factories fueled the demand for southern cotton, which ensured the continued existence of the American slave system, which created slaves as a social class even lower than the working poor. But we'll look at the life of slaves and the structure of slave society in a future video. While women had been given an honorable status in the new republic, that so-called Republican motherhood, there now came the view that women were to concern themselves with family and the home, and to leave the business and political matters to the men, especially as the U.S. was increasingly industrializing. And this is an idea called the cult of domesticity. This is especially prevalent amongst the middle class, mainly because those at the bottom simply couldn't afford to not have paid work. While factories had offered opportunities for young women to work outside the home and earn their own money, most women working in the early factories were single, and it was expected that they would move into the domestic sphere once they did get married. Those same women, though, were actually having fewer children, as birth rates, particularly in the cities, began to decline. One reason for this is that while on farms, having more children is an advantage since they can work on the farm, basically as free labor. In a wage economy, more children are more of a financial burden, particularly when they're young. With slightly smaller families, that meant women could devote more time to the children that they had, or they could try and correct problems in society, which we're going to look at in more detail when we start looking at the reform movements of the early 19th century in our next unit. Well, that's what you need to know about topic 4.6 and the effects of the market revolution on society and American culture. We'll catch you next time.